and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian.moore.
We're back in Manchester's Central Library doing our podcast this week. And as usual, we start with our news items. Sebastian's going to go very international, and I'm going to go local government. So we're the opposite ends.
We're covering the spectrum, aren't we?
Yes. In Bring Me Solutions, we'll be joined by Vanessa Pupavac. We're not quite sure if that's the right pronunciation, but we will check with her when she joins us, who wants to talk about some of the problems with globalism versus nationalism. And then we have a very interesting culture club. So, shall we start with you, Sebastian? And I know you're never one to shy away from the very difficult issues, and you want to tackle one of the big ones of today, don't you?
Yes, and if you're sat there thinking, what could it be? Just ask yourself, what is the most contentious issue you could bring up at the dinner table? And yes, you're right, it's Israel-Gaza. So the reason that I want to talk about it today is because there is this ceasefire deal which looks imminent. And this is something which potentially when we release this on Friday might not have transpired, or it might have happened. So if it hasn't happened, then I still think that a lot of the content of what's in it is relevant to the story itself. So let me just sort of give a quick summary of what's going on, the state of play. So for anybody that somehow was in a coma during 2023, 2024, I'll start from 7th of October, 2023.
I think that's a good place to start. Yeah.
It seems to be, doesn't it? So Hamas obviously attacked southern Israel and took more than 250 hostages back to Gaza. Since then, Israel has sent troops in, and there has been this ongoing war in which tens of thousands of people have died. One of the problems about the figures is that the figures come from the Hamas-led health ministry, which claim that I think over 45,000 dead at the moment, but we don't know if that's an accurate number or not. So back in May, President Biden announced that there was a potential for a ceasefire deal. That didn't happen, and now we find ourselves in January 2025, and there's a new deal back on the table, which is quite similar to that one, and it looks like it is going to occur. And there are reports of people that are involved in the talks saying it is just a case of crossing the I's and dotting the T's.
It sometimes seems that crossing the I's and... No, it's the other way around, isn't it? Dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
Did I say crossing the I's, dotting the T's?
I'm not sure which you said, but I think I stumbled over it.
I might be inventing a new writing system.
So those kind of small details often seem to be quite intractable issues in the Middle East, don't they?
Yeah, and don't underestimate the chances of this not happening, because there's always a chance. Even when the deal is announced and they agree on it, either side could go back against the deal. So who knows?
So do you want to tell us a bit about who's brokering the deal and what the deal looks like?
Yeah, so the US are involved as well as Qatar. I'll tell you a little bit about what the deal looks like. So essentially it would involve 3 stages. Stage 1 would last 60 days and would involve the release of 33 hostages. These are women, children, and men over 50, or the wounded and sick, essentially. And that would happen gradually over a 6-week period. In return, Israel would release 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Now, some of these people will have been convicted of deadly attacks. However, none of them, this is what the reports are saying at the moment, none of them will be people that were involved in October the 7th. Part of that, the stage 1 would be Israel beginning its withdrawal and pulling back troops, and it would allow unarmed residents to return to North Gaza, where everybody has been evacuated. And Gaza's got 2.3 million people, something like that, and almost all of the population of Gaza have been uprooted from this war. And the final part of stage 1 is that it would allow aid to get into Gaza on a scale greater than it is happening at the moment. So at the moment, there's about 50 trucks a day, and they think that they could increase that to something like 600 trucks a day. So a huge, huge increase. Then essentially stage 2 and 3, the talks for those stages would begin on the 16th day of stage 1. That would depend on stage 1 still being ongoing, which means that both sides abiding by the agreement. Stage 2 would likely include the more hostages being released, bodies of the dead being returned, and involve talks on a complete IDF withdrawal.
Israeli Defence Force.
Exactly, Israeli Defence Force. And then stage 3 would likely be the reconstruction of Gaza, and this is much more sort of long-term. And supposedly Israeli forces would remain in a sort of buffer zone to guarantee the security of Israel, because I think one of the things that they're adamant on, Israel, is that they have to be able to say to their population that there is no chance of another terrorist attack happening like the one on October the 7th.
So everything you've said so far is about talks between Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
Israel's effectively also at war with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't cover that, but presumably everything stops at the same time?
Or? Part of the idea at the moment is to pressure Iran into making sure that because essentially Hamas have links to Iran, and the idea is to pressure Iran into encouraging Hamas to accept a deal.
Right, okay.
There is some opposition to this deal within Israel. I'm sure there's opposition to the deal in Gaza as well. So there are a couple of politicians on the right that are part of the Israeli government because they have a coalition. So there's Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister. And basically Ben-Gvir has said he's suggested that he'd resign if this deal is approved. Now, that probably wouldn't lead to the fall of the Netanyahu government, Netanyahu being the Prime Minister of Israel. And Smotrich, who he said that he opposes the deal but hasn't indicated that he would resign.
Can I ask a question about America? So it's still 5 days, isn't it, until Donald Trump is inaugurated? Is that the right word, inaugurated?
Inaugurated, yeah.
Yeah. So is Biden taking any role in this, or is this happening effectively under the new administration before it's really in power?
So both sides in American politics will claim victory for this. Now, advocates of Biden would say he has played a key role in bringing Israel and Hamas to the table and pressuring them to make a deal. Obviously, he announced in May that there was a potential deal. It didn't happen. And now we're in January, just before he's about to step down as president, and a deal looks likely. So you could say this, the history books will show that it happened whilst he was president. However, people on the other side of the political aisle will claim that this is a result of Trump. And Trump, as we all know, is a bit of a wrecking ball. And he said that if he comes into office on the 20th of January and there's no deal, there'll be hell to pay.
Okay.
And a lot of people are suggesting that his words and his rhetoric have encouraged the two sides to make a deal before he becomes president.
Right, okay. So I think what you're pointing to is that whoever's administration it is, there is a big finger marks of the American presidency on this.
Yeah, and I mean, we're used to America being the global policeman. And I think there is an attempt, because of what's happened over the last 20 years or so, there's a push against America being involved in these sorts of things. And there's an attempt, certainly from some within Washington, to sort of exert its power a little bit more. And it's a difficult line to tread. I think we should be non-interventionist, personally, the UK. I certainly don't think we should be sending our young men to be fighting in foreign countries. But we also need to exert our power. And I mean, you get into a much larger conversation about what that power looks like and what's considered soft power, because I think these things are really important. Just as a sort of tangent to that, but I think it links to the Trump aspect as well. You'll remember that in episode 1, we talked about the Chagos Islands.
I do.
and I'm always looking for any opportunity to go back to the Chagos Islands. I think it's important that when we're doing this podcast, we mention news stories. It's important to arc back and say what's the latest on that. So essentially, since we've done that story, because Mauritius got a new leader and the new president is not in such favour of the deal, and this would be because he thinks that Mauritius get a bad end of the deal, and he wants to see supposedly higher investment from the UK into Mauritius as recompense for the UK leasing Diego Garcia, which, if anybody wasn't listening, is the main island in the Chagos Islands, which holds a joint US-UK military base, which is really important strategically. Now, somehow, and I think this is quite remarkable, but somehow, essentially, there are reports that Trump is against this deal that the UK have brokered with Mauritius because he is concerned for the security of the army base on Diego Garcia. And I think we're living in a very strange world where we're relying on a foreign leader to protect British interests when Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are determined to give away the Chagos Islands, and not just give it away, but pay Mauritius for the benefit. It's really... it's hard to sort of speak neutrally on these things because it is hard to get your head around. And I think we do live in a weird news cycle where, since Labour have come into power, I think we won't be the only ones to say that they have made some catastrophic errors. And I almost would hold this up as the highest of them, not because it affects people as much as, let's say, the winter fuel payments or other things, but because it outlines the complete lack of any sort of ability in terms of foreign policy and in terms of protecting our own strategic interests. Now, essentially this week, what's been happening is the government, so the UK government, have been trying to push through this deal with Mauritius before Trump becomes president. Now, the latest on this is that that's not going to happen, and they're going to have to wait. So the deal is not going to be signed off until Trump becomes president, and then who knows what. And I am not going to be the one to predict what happens when Trump gets into office.
All cards are off the table at that point, aren't they? So I think what you said there was that, we see this as a real clear example of some of the missteps that the Labour Party have taken. And I think one of the things that maybe joins up some of those missteps is around this idea of what does it mean to be a nation? And I think that's one of the things we're going to look at a bit more in Bring Me Solutions.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Okay, tell me what's happening around these councils and unitary authorities.
Yes, so you're probably aware that government has an agenda, a devolution agenda, which was outlined in its manifesto. And the idea of this is that people should have more control over things that affect them locally, taking power away from Westminster, which all sounds good, I think. Those are things that I would, in theory, support.
And we have an incredibly centralised system in the UK, don't we?
We do, and it's very bureaucratic. So the idea is to devolve some of that power. And we already have some of that devolution for the metro mayors. So, for example, transport, planning, skills and employment, some of those things are already devolved in the areas where they have metro mayors. And I think I've said to you before, I was very much against having a mayor in Manchester, and I'm a bit of a convert, because it does seem that on things like transport and planning, having one person who has authority over a very wide geographical area does seem to be able to move some of the barriers to getting things done. So I am a bit of a convert to thinking that maybe metro mayors are a good idea.
It helps that Andy Burnham is one of the better Labour politicians.
Absolutely, I think that's right. Yes, yeah. So the first way this devolution is affecting us in the real world is around a discussion about the postponement of some of the local elections this year in 2025. So in the UK, there are broadly two ways in which local government can be organised. There's what we call the unitary authorities, which are big and, they control pretty much everything. Or there are areas where you have two-tier local government, so you have county councils and district councils. So to give you one example of those, in Derbyshire, there's Derbyshire County Council, which is the kind of top-level tier. And then there are district councils like Bolsover, Chesterfield, Amber Valley, Derbyshire Dales. How would you pronounce this? Erewash? Erewash?
Erewash.
I don't know.
No idea. If you're from there, please tell us.
High Peak in South Derbyshire. So,
and when I was growing up, I remember the local district councils becoming a unitary authority. So where I grew up in Dorset, we were part of Purbeck District Council.
Okay.
And then we became part of the Dorset County Council, which became a unitary authority.
So a long time before that, Sebastian, in 1974, when we had local government reorganisation first up here, we lost Lancashire County Council, which we were part of, and became part of Greater Manchester. And my dad is still complaining about that 50 years later. So I think there is part of the discussion around this is the fact that you do lose that kind of attachment to local councils and the old shires and counties that perhaps people do feel a kind of visceral, emotional attachment to. That's, I think, part of the discussion around this. So what the government want to do as part of their devolution agenda is to move everybody onto unitary authorities. So this is not meant to be a kind of overnight thing where it all happens on one day, but they are inviting councils now to give them proposals to how they will move from two-tier to unitary authorities. As I understand it, they won't necessarily all be approved at the same time, so there'll probably be a few tranches of this. I think there's still about a quarter of the population are still subject to two-tier authorities. So people are putting together kind of proposals and bids now to become unitary authorities. And if they're going to do that, they can, if they wish, and again, I don't believe they have to, they can apply to postpone local elections due this year. If they do that, they have to commit to doing the reorganisation within a year and having elections, which will include a mayoral election then, within a year of whenever they were due to have them this year. So generally May this year. So it's hard, I think, on one level, isn't it, to see this as anything other than politicians who perhaps don't feel very loved trying to avoid being thrown out. And I think a lot of kind of cynical discussion of this is around that point. But this is clearly part of a much wider agenda, and I don't think we should necessarily be distracted by that point about the postponement of elections. I think we should be arguing that elections shouldn't be postponed, but the discussion around how best to provide services to people and how best to engage people in their local services is a good one to have. Now, I think we would argue quite strongly that we do want people to have more control and power over the way that services are provided. But the problem is that then becomes quite a managerial discussion about whether unitary authorities are better than two-tier. There's quite a lot of research on this, and some of the research indicates that unitary authorities are perhaps more efficient. But as we've said already, one of the things that unitary authorities do tend to do is kind of estrange people from their local government because it kind of feels further away. Now, I think people can live with it feeling further away if the bins are collected more efficiently and all those kind of things that people really care about, the potholes and everything like that. But I think a wider discussion about how people exert their democratic control over councils should be part of the idea of moving to unitary authorities.
So on this, I said to you before we were recording that it kind of frustrates me sometimes how the conversation around devolution versus centralisation gets formed within that binary spectrum.
Yeah.
I think binary spectrum is an oxymoron, personally.
Yeah.
A false binary, don't know. So the reasons that you'd want, and you kind of alluded to this, the reasons that you'd want more devolution is so that people can have more of a say in terms of what's going on in their local area.
Agreed.
Which is, and I'm all for that, and I generally say I'm on the devolution end of the scale. However, the arguments against that and maybe centralising certain things would be for efficiency, like you mentioned. Now, it doesn't mean that more devolution leads to more say, and it doesn't mean more devolution leads to less efficiency. And we have to try and do both of those. And I worry that so often when our current politicians and the current political system we have, when they get hold of something like this, they just mess it up and we end up with the worst of both worlds.
I agree. And I would say that most of the stuff I've read from those councillors who are thinking about putting together bids to do this is couched almost entirely in terms of efficiency. There's kind of managerial discussion about how do we best manage the park system, things like that. And I would say that what I would want more of is a discussion on democracy and how we make sure that those people can be held to account by their local populations. And one of the things, as I understand it, is that whilst districts and county councils will have some say in whether or not to move to a unitary authority and which kind of flavour of unitary authority that they choose, there won't be any say for local people, so there won't be any referendums on this. There won't be any testing the democratic waters on this. So I think the way that people should be thinking about how they engage with the whole discussion is through their councillors. So if you're in a two-tier area, you should be engaging with councillors now about how you would want to see that developing. And I think for so long we've kind of got into this habit of saying, well, that's for the politicians to do. And I think re-engaging and reinvigorating a local democratic discussion could be actually a side effect of this discussion, which would be, I think, a good thing.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. And I'm concerned, I feel like I'm being quite pessimistic today, but I'm concerned that we will lose sight of what the point of councils are. And I feel, certainly living here in Manchester, completely out of touch with the local government and who my councillors are. Obviously I'm involved in politics, so I know these things, I look them up, I keep track of, but I have no contact with my councillors. It's a very, very distant process for the majority of the public, and you can easily, I do think it's important for people to make more of an effort to actually be involved and to know what's going on, but it also they have to know that they can do that and that there is a process for it, and at the moment I feel like that process is so out of touch to the average person.
I agree. So I'm not quite sure exactly how people should go about this, but certainly if you're in one of these authorities that are thinking about moving, I would be looking out for any local meetings that are going to take place, and perhaps trying to arrange to see councillors to make sure that they're thinking not just about efficiencies and how the change might impact on costs, but also about how it changes their engagement with local communities. Yeah,
and in the spirit of bringing solutions, not just problems, one of the ways to encourage people to have more of an involvement in the local democracy is to change the voting system. Here in Manchester, 90% of the councillors are Labour. Like I mentioned 2 weeks ago, at one point in 2015, every single councillor, 95, and there was one vacancy, 95 councillors on the Manchester City Council, and all of them were Labour. How on earth can you have a democratic process when that's the situation? And you'd think, and this is what I thought before I came to Manchester, I thought, oh, that's a Labour stronghold, Manchester, Liverpool. Not really. I mean, they obviously have a plurality of votes, but they don't even necessarily have a majority. There is a massive amount of opposition to Labour, but because of the voting system, first past the post, which the Labour Party as a whole is against, because of that voting system, we end up with the same councillors no matter what, really. And it takes an awful lot for somebody to get elected. So changing the voting system at local level would be huge.
It would, And I agree with doing that. The other thing I would just say, though, is that whenever we look at any election results, whether they be local council or by-elections or the general election, the biggest group of people is always the people who don't vote. And for us, making sure that we can connect with those non-voters is important. And if you're a non-voter yourself, I'm going to do that thing and say, well, if you don't vote, you can't complain. So please get out and vote.
Yes. And I actually said to you a while back when I stood in a by-election, council by-election, and there was an 11% turnout. So 11% of the people that could vote voted. And I said, do you know what? If you get a minority turnout, so if less than 50% people vote, I don't think you should get a councillor. I think that would be a way to get people to vote.
Should be made to vote again. Try again. Must try harder.
Indeed.
That's your teaching genes coming out there. In Bring Me Solutions this week, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Vanessa Pupavac, who is a senior lecturer in international relations based in Nottingham. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And Vanessa wants to talk a little bit about some of the problems around the concept of nation states and globalism and some of the tensions between those two ideas. So, Vanessa, over to you.
Right. I suppose one of the things I'd like to highlight is around globalisation and global governance. So we just start with those two concepts. So globalisation, in summary, means economic interdependence and also has meant closer economic integration. So we can think about it in terms of supply chains, outsourcing of production. We can also think about it in terms of, where we source, particular minerals that need for energy, all of those things around the sort of the economic globalization. So that's one side of globalization, around sort of closer economic relations, closer economic interdependence and economic integration. So that's one side, that's globalization. And then the second side is related to the concept of what we call global governance. And the simplest way of putting this is around political interdependence and political integration of around frameworks, whether they're frameworks around membership of the European Union or whether they're frameworks, say, around the United Nations and frameworks such as the Millennium Development Goals. And so you have the sort of integration of political or policy goals and targets. Another one would be, say, for example, around the Paris Accords and net zero. So that's basically those two concepts of globalization and global governance.
Sometimes people use a phrase, the international rules-based order. Is that the thing that depends on those global governments?
Right. So here I think it's useful to take a step back and think about the international system that developed in the 20th century. So if we go back historically, there have been all sorts of ways of organising societies, but up until the 20th century, empire was the norm, and organising around democratic nation states was the exception. But if we look at the outcome of the two world wars, so the Great War, the First World War, and then the Second World War, how we might summarise that is that the outcome of the First World War was promoted the principle of nation states against empires in Europe. And the outcome of the Second World War promoted the internationalized that principle of how do we organize the international system. It's no longer going to be around empire. The principle is going to be nation states. And we can see that under the UN, the United Nations Charter of 1945, beginning, it starts out with we the peoples, and then it goes through a set of principles around sovereign equality, national sovereignty, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. Now, we're still a world of empire, but empire is in retreat, and the remaining imperial powers are saying, well, justifying their continuing rule in terms of preparation for national self-determination. Empire as a principle has been delegitimized. We've got this new principle of national sovereignty.
And what are the problems with that now? Why is that? Is that breaking down? Is that the issue now?
Right. So we've got these two tensions, if you like, between the UN Charter that is organised around the principle of self-determining democratic states, and then you've got this tension with these developments of globalisation and global governance that are in tension. Yeah. So how did that come about? Essentially, we lost a belief in a world, this new world that we created that we established in principle around nation states. Now, if we're looking at Britain, we need to look at when did we lose confidence with the idea of being a self-governing nation state?
I'm aware of the fact that some people might be listening to this and thinking, why do we need to be a self-governing nation state? You mentioned this economic interdependence and the global governance, and a lot of people say that has led to a reduction in global poverty. So why might somebody put the case forward for greater self-governance as a nation state?
Right. So let's take a step back until why did we get here? Why did we think, particularly from the 1990s into the 2000s, why did we think that we needed to embrace globalization and global governance? And I think you've got to look back to the crisis of Britain in the 1970s. And if you look at that crisis of Britain in the 1970s, it's essentially that economic crisis, essentially the Conservatives who are more that lose faith with the nation state and popular democracy domestically, and decide we need to join the European community, also known as the common market, that they become very nervous about sort of industrial action, and they see rather than relating to the domestic electorate, the domestic constituency, they decide that the solutions for Britain are their closer alignment with elites across Europe, Western Europe, So that's essentially and then what you have in the 1980s is that in the context of the defeat of the miners' strike and the sort of retreat of trade union activism, you have the labour movement also embracing transnational or solutions, that they also turn to organisations like the European Community as the best way they saw as defending their interests. So they gave up on domestic politics in a series of defeats that they'd experienced with the successive successes of conservative governments, and they saw the solution in terms of turning towards European institutions. So that's sort of how we got there. But it's essentially in different ways. Both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party lost faith with democratic politics and mobilising popular democracy towards the sort of vision of the country that they wanted to pursue. Now, why have we got, and then in the course of the 1990s, the European Community deepened and widened in terms of its transformation from a European Community to a European Union. So many of your listeners will be familiar with this development. And really what you have after the end of the Cold War is that domestic political elites in the West and many sort of political actors or activists in Western societies to turn towards the international as the way to do politics. That they were demoralised domestically, they'd lost confidence with domestic change, and they looked towards international institutions, whether those were regional European institutions or whether they were institutions such as the UN. They turned towards the international. And we see that at different levels, whether it's political parties, whether it's civil servants, whether it's local authorities. In different ways, you have our institutions turning towards global solutions. In other words, rather than taking their cue from domestic constituents, they look towards international institutions to agree their policies. Essentially, that's what we've seen. Now, that was all going fine in a sense. I've sort of missed out some certain things, just as politicians gave up domestically. So domestically, we all sort of withdrew into the domestic sphere, and we were all busy decorating our houses and just trying to get on with our lives. But that really shook up. I think you can see in this sort of new global order in different was challenged in a number of ways. I think critically, the 2008 Great Depression challenged the idea that we could outsource solutions, that we could outsource the Bank of England, the powers of the Bank of England. We outsource that. Instead of those being determined within Parliament, we outsourced that. So so I think 2008 was a key critical challenge to the idea that we could happily get on with our lives, and that you had all these economic technocrats expertly running the economy, and we didn't need to worry our heads about it. So that really challenged the idea that of this sort of new global integrated management of solutions. So that's one side. But there's also the challenge. So that's the challenge to globalization. But there's also the challenge to that global governance, that challenge to political integration as well.
And I think you can see lots of people starting to question all those global governance issues. So, and Brexit's probably one obvious example, but some of the discussion now about leaving the European Court of Human Rights and some of those other organisations, some of the discussion around net zero, it does seem that there's quite a widespread questioning of that global governance side of your initial explanation.
Yeah, so I think, again, if we make big generalisations, so if you look at some of the criticisms of, many of the criticisms of globalisation have tended to come more from the left or left-leaning people, whereas criticisms of global governance have tended to come from more from conservatives, more from the right. But I think and I think one of the reasons why the left is so much in crisis is that it has stuck with organisations like the European Union. Although, as we know from the left in Britain was opposed to the European community because it's got baked in ideas of a sort of market model of the economy, but it's stuck with the European Union and these things because it likes the political integration that they've got more faith in global governance organisations than they have with popular democracy.
And is it right to say that perhaps what we need to do is to challenge both of those globalising influences that you talked about, both the governance issues and the integration on an economic basis, so that we can do things like, for example, protect our steel industry, some of the things that we'd like to do that we're actually unable to do?
Yes, and I think also some of the issues around a while back at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about a rules-based order. I think there is a concern that not only that a rules-based order has become the rule of lawyers, not democracy accountability, and there's a sort of and I think very poignantly and tragically, we've seen, one of the problems with or one of the concerns around global governance was about, we want to hard bake a whole set of ideals beyond democratic change. So in particular, human rights. So we want to hard bake that into that they transcend any sort of vagaries of different, different governments coming in, different political parties coming in, and then more and more areas got institutionalized as human rights. Now, the difficulty with that is, well, how do you reconcile the tension between different sorts of rights? Now, what the principles of freedom of speech and the right and freedom from persecution and so on, as against more and more things that got added to be human rights. And so essentially what you had a sort of form of governance at a distance where all these edicts were coming out. More and more areas were being codified as beyond, with good intentions and so on, beyond democratic change. But the difficulty with that is where they contradict each other. Or how do you, and increasingly it's frontline staff that have to somehow reconcile the contradictions of these institutionalized policies. Now, really poignantly, and I do want to highlight this, is that the irony is that that when you make more and more things into law, actually what we've done is we've stretched the rule of law to breaking point. And really poignantly, as are you have organisations, you've had a whole movement around human rights advocacy. At the same internationally, at the same time, we've had an erosion of the enforcement of law domestically. So very tragically, at the same time, we have politicians such as William Hague involved in initiatives against sexual violence to women and girls internationally. We've had a neglect of addressing violence against girls domestically, most recently, as we've been discussing in relation to the grooming gangs and so on. So there is a problem with this governance at a distance, that we have a proliferation of lawmaking or regulations at a distance, but a breakdown of that relationship of people and law and institutions and law.
So I think this is fascinating, and it's a very wide-ranging discussion, and I'm aware of the fact that we're running out of time. And we've touched on things like the European Union, the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, and I certainly think those are things that we should return to at some point and look at in more detail. But I just wanted to say that it strikes me that there are two camps of people in British politics. Well, certainly this is what's portrayed in the media, that you've got the people that will sort of sacrifice all of the sovereignty to foreign courts and to other bodies, to international bodies. And then you've got the people that are very inward looking and want to sort of detach ourselves from the rest of the world. And something that really attracted me to the SDP is the fact that we're outward looking and we want to cooperate with other countries. We're culturally pro-European, but we believe that the British public should be the ones that have the say on that instead of technocrats and lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would reconcile that is that I'm a Democrat and I'm an internationalist. So I don't want Britain interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries, because we've got two left feet. We don't understand. And similarly domestically. So I want an international order based around the principle of national self-determination. Why is that? And why national sovereignty? It's about accountability. Now, the key difficulty with globalization and global governance is who's in charge. Who is accountable to policies? The aspect that is clarifying about that is critical about national sovereignty is we know, it's clear the lines of accountability are clear, and I suppose that and the critical thing in terms of the sort of the policy solution, when you start talking about globalization and global governance, it literally goes everywhere. But I think on the positive side, it is about revitalising Parliament and parliamentary sovereignty. Now, where does parliamentary sovereignty come from? It's a relationship with people. It's about authority, and where does it derive its authority and legitimacy from? It's from popular democracy. It's a relationship to people. So it's this aspect of a clear relationship with people.
And I think that brings us back quite nicely to the discussion we had earlier about local democracy when we were talking about devolution and local government. It's the same point, I think, is that, the people need to be in charge of their...
And the conversation we had earlier about international cooperation surrounding conflicts. So today's episode has been very interlinked.
It has, great. So brilliant. I think that probably brings us then to Culture Club. Thanks for that input, Vanessa. We'll give you a little rest if that's okay for a moment. I know you've got something to bring to Culture Club, but perhaps I should jump in first, because I want to talk about Monty Don's Great British Gardens. Are you a gardener, Vanessa?
I am in fits, so I love gardening, but I'm a sort of slash and, I like battling big weeds and stuff, and I'm less of the sort of finesse of the garden.
Well, I'm going to suggest you listen to, you watch Great British Gardens. It's a 5-part series, and he's starting in Scotland and working his way down the UK. In Scotland, he went to Royal Gardens and Community Gardens, so all kinds of different places. I really liked Little Sparta, which is the garden of Ian Hamilton Finlay, the Scottish poet. He also went to a place called Chillingham Castle. I'm just going to play you a little clip of what he said there.
I've got huge pleasure from this garden because it exemplifies something that is very British. I've come over the border, I'm in England, but it's still something that stretches right across the United Kingdom, which is this combination of eccentricity and a deep love and passion for history and place, which is nurtured through the creation and care of a garden.
So I thought that was a fantastic interpretation of what gardening is. Just a couple of other things he said. He made the point that in lots of other places, people don't do their gardens themselves. They just pay somebody else to do it. And Britain's probably one of the only places where there's the idea that if somebody's helped you, it's not pure enough. Your garden isn't pure enough. And he also made the point that, in our culture, it's a kind of universally accepted activity across all classes and races. If you go into any room, he says, if you go into any room or a pub anywhere, you'll find somebody else who shares your interest in gardening. And I think it's something that you can just engage on at any level. I think I can call a friend of the show, Catherine. My friend Catherine knows the Latin name for every single flower. And when she visits a garden with her sister, she, rattles off these Latin names. And her sister just says, can you not just enjoy the flowers? And I really like the fact that you can, really enjoy it on all those levels. So I have a double recommendation for Monty Don's Great British Gardens and for actual gardening. So, Vanessa, you wanted to bring a couple of books to Culture Club, didn't you?
Yeah. So I won't say more about my gardening skills, but I love it. But in fits and starts. So the two books I wanted to bring along to Culture Club are the Gallows Poll by Benjamin Myers and his more recent book, Cuddy. So the first one, the Gallows Poll, some of you may know it from the TV series. So that's about criminals, but basically it's about the setting Calderdale, so West Yorkshire, set in. It's about the 18th century coiners who are basically clipping coins and forging coins, and obviously they get into trouble, which is why he was able to write his book, because it's based some of it's based on court cases from the 18th century. Anyway, that's a great read. So that's his book, the earlier book about criminals. The BBC, just a 3-part series with directed by Shane Meadows. That's more sort of comedy. The comedy side, but anyway, it's great as comedy. This is a bit more angry and obviously, if you're in trouble with the law in the 18th century, it doesn't end well. But the second book, so the first book is all about criminals. The second book is all about saints. Well, it's Saint Cuthbert, so he's gone from criminals to saints, and it's about the 7th century saint, St Cuthbert, Lindisfarne, through the centuries, and ending up in Durham. So just that's it's a book of sort of short stories, poems, that, those of you who don't like conventional things, start on page 182 and skip the former part. But it's so clever. What he's done is basically gone from sort of old English, sort of Anglo-Saxon Venerable Bede style type of writing, to then a more sort of medieval story with a sort of Chaucer type writing, then a Victorian sort of ghost story type writing, and then culminating in a modern day story that is perhaps the most powerful indictment of our current insecure agency, cash in hand economy. One of the most powerful stories that I've read on the subject, and a modern Michael Cuthbert, trying to get by in this insecure economy and do right by his mother. You talked about gardening, Hilary. This is a book with, very sharp socially, but Ben Myers loves nature. He loves, lots of poetic words and so on. Anyway, that's my recommendation. And just to say, last year, the Gallows poll won my local book club's book of the year. So I'm hoping to recommend this and try and get a win for my book choice with Cuddy.
That
Excellent.
Sounds great. And a shout out to book clubs as well there.
Exactly. I started a book club last year, which is going very strongly. So a shout out to my book club group. I'm sure all of them, listen to the podcast, and potentially will put Cuddy on the list, because that sounds really interesting.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. So thanks for listening, everybody. If you're enjoying our podcasts, please do recommend them to others. And if you are enjoying them, you might well want to consider joining the SDP. So please go and check out our website, sdp.org.uk, where you can find a joining form. Everybody's welcome. Thanks for listening. See you next week.